All right, so welcome to the NASPA Region 3 HBCU webinar series with Dr. K, myself. I'm excited that this webinar series has launched. We are in the second episode, and today we're talking about the LGBTQ plus community and engagement at HBCUs. And I have the pleasure of having three phenomenal colleagues joining me on this discussion. And so let's kind of get into it, just some logistics. Once again, this is being recorded. We will have a Q&A at the end. So if you want to, if you have questions throughout, you want to place them in the chat, please do that. Also, please mute yourselves as well. So I want to start off with just giving honor to historically Black colleges and universities in our nation, and honoring the fact that the first HBCU, Cheney University out in Pennsylvania, was established in 1837. So that's where it all began. So we've been here. We've been doing this work for quite some time. And so excited that I'm able to just kind of carry on the legacy of our institutions, our HBCUs, and demonstrating to you all the work that we're doing. So let's get into our guests on today. We have Dr. Brent Lewis, who serves as the Associate Vice President for Diversity and Equity and Inclusion at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. He leads the DEI unit within Student Affairs, which includes the Office of Disability Services, the LGBTQ Resource Center, and the Center for Multicultural Student Services. He earned his PhD in Leadership Studies from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University in Greensboro, North Carolina. He has worked in higher education at various types of colleges and universities, such as Randolph College, Fayetteville State University, and North Carolina Central University. Dr. Lewis is passionate about diversity and inclusion and in creating safe and affirming spaces for all students. His research agenda has focused on the lived experiences of gay and lesbian students attending historically Black colleges and universities. Please welcome Dr. Brent Lewis. Hey, how are you?
I'm great, Dr. K. How are you?
I'm well. I'm glad to have you here.
Glad to be here.
Next, we have Jennifer Williams, who is a creator and educator who has made a profession out of being the change that she wants to see in the world. Currently serving as the interim director of the North Carolina Central Women's Center, associate director of diversity and inclusion, and as the program coordinator of the nation's premier LGBTA resource at the illustrious North Carolina Central University. I just want to sound A&T. That took a lot for me to say that. But having held careers in radio broadcasting, education, and health, and health print journalism in rural North Carolina, as well as sales and marketing, allowed Williams to observe the impact of economic deinvestment from rural areas. Working and volunteering in the North Carolina K-12 public school system has also allowed her for a unique perspective of how educational investment has a direct impact in a family's collective trajectory in life. Welcome, Ms. Jennifer Williams. How are you?
I'm so glad to be here. I'm doing well. I hope you are.
Yes, yes. And last and certainly not least, we have Dr. Steve Mobley Jr., who is a proud native of Washington, D.C., and has dedicated his life to enhancing the post-secondary educational experiences of underrepresented students. He is currently an assistant professor of higher education at the University of Alabama and the Department of Educational Leadership, Policy, and Technology Studies. His scholarship focuses on the contemporary placement of historically Black colleges and universities. Particularly, Dr. Mobley Jr.'s research underscores and highlights the understudied facets of HBCU communities, including issues surrounding race, social class, and student sexuality. Dr. Mobley Jr. has extensive experience in the field of higher education. Before entering the profession, he held several positions within the fields of academic and student affairs and was an administrator for well over a decade. He earned his BA in Communication and Culture from Howard University. Upon graduating from Howard, he completed his master's in higher education management from the University of Pennsylvania, and most recently, he earned his PhD in higher education from the University of Maryland. Welcome, Dr. Mobley Jr., and I see you're repping with your Howard sweatshirt on today.
Yes, I had to.
I am so excited for the three of you to be here to talk about this topic in regards to the LGBTQ community and engagement at HBCUs. And those of you who may not be aware, this is the month of LGBT history and awareness. So this is timely. And I know, and I'm just going to put a segment out there that we did a prep session and it was on point. So I know y'all going to bring it, keep that same energy. Once again, if you are tuning in, if you have questions throughout, please place those in the chat, but we will have Q&A at the end. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about the history of LGBTQ plus and the Black community. Kind of give some background as it relates to maybe your own experiences and also your own personal anecdotes as it relates to the history of the LGBTQ community and the Black community. Who wants to start us off?
Okay, I'll dive in. Alrighty, so pretty much as long as there has been a Black community, there have been LGBT people who've been a part of that community. A lot of times when people think about Black history, especially Black history as it's taught here in America, it'll start off with slavery. But Black people have been around for a much, much longer time than chattel slavery as it existed here in North America. And so we can look at, as I was actually doing research to, just kind of brushing up for this, I found a map on PBS's website. I'm going to drop that link in the chat as well, where it just pointed out like all these different places in all over the world where there have been very long-standing histories of folks that we would now call, in today's vernacular, LGBTQIA plus folks. But as long as there's been a Black community, there have been people who existed within spaces outside of these very neatly defined pink and blue boxes. And what pink means and what blue means and who you're attracted to. These people have been transgressing, well, the LGBT community has been transgressing these types of very neatly defined roles for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Feel free to unmute.
Jump in, Dr. Mobley.
Okay. With this mute and unmute, it's yes.
Right.
All of these things. When I think about the history of, LGBTQ plus, and the Black community, I don't think that it is an either or, really. You have had people here, as Jennifer just stated, that predates, chattel slavery, right? I recently wrote something where I was speaking of the fact that at least within the Black community, you are seeing, if you are, identifying with this LGBTQ plus community, and you are Black, it's like those are separate things, or you need to be able to place those into boxes, right? So we're thinking about that even in history. I think that we've had many people who may not have had the language, but even if we're thinking about back to when our arrival, as Jennifer stated before, even we were forced onto those boats, even here, during slavery, like there are slave narratives and things where you can find relationships or semblances of relationships on these plantations and people having these families and, so forth and so on that were many times same sex, right? So what does that look like? You can't separate it. And I think that people think of this as a very contemporary phenomenon, and it is not. I think people want to place Blackness in competition with queerness and transness, like during the Harlem Renaissance, and I'm like, no, boo-boo, like it goes back, much further. Or maybe even they want to start at Stonewall, and that's just not the case. I think that establishing that there's always been Black LGBTQ people, being able to trace it back to prior to that, I think kind of rattles people, and it shakes up a conversation in a very different way. Because people do think of this as this new phenomenon.
Right.
I would just agree with everything my colleagues have said. I grew up religious, so if you even date back to the Bible, we were there. Dr. Mobley just talked about Stonewall. Marsha P. Johnson. There were Black trans women. There were Black folks very involved in that work. We've always been around. As long as there have been Black people, we've been in the spaces. I think as you think about our history, though, we have not always been out and seen about our sexuality or our gender identity. But as years have gone on, I think we have seen a shift in the way that we show up in spaces.
Right.
Working with college students, I definitely see that shift in Gen Z and in millennials, though I'm a millennial myself. I'm on a much further end of the spectrum than my students. But I think as we look at the Black community and the transformations that have happened over the years, there has been a change in the way that this history has progressed. Even looking at Black Lives Matter, that was created by Black queer women. So the intersections of our identities are not as siloed as the overarching Black community would like that to be.
And I'm glad you mentioned this whole idea of intersection and intersectionality, right? And when you think about the idea of being Black, being part of the LGBTQ community, and then you mentioned, Dr. Lewis, the spirituality, religious piece. And a lot of times in spaces for students, because of the types of services and programs we may provide, they may feel like they have to pick one or the other to show up as, versus how do I show up as my whole authentic self and be safe, number one, and be comfortable in who I am, that the people around me are also safe and comfortable. So that idea of intersectionality is always in the back of my head when I'm working with students, regardless of their sexual background, regardless of their racial background. But in this context, that's really big, you know, because I think about the fact that you all have said the LGBTQ community, as this term now, has been here in the Black community. But it's a taboo conversation within the Black community, because it's kind of like, I'm gonna be transparent. Y'all know I'm a disruptive scholar, right? So when you think about the Black community, it's like, oh, that's, your uncle's friend or your aunt's friend. It's not, that's his boyfriend, that's her girlfriend conversation. And so that tacks on to the family environment, which students bring here, right? And then you think about students at our spaces at HBCUs, this is family oriented for them. And this is sometimes the only space where they can be who they are. And then you tack on COVID, and some of them have to stay home, and they can't be who they are in that setting. So that's a very eye-opening point that you all have made as it relates to the history, and then also the intersections of all of those identities. So Dr. Mobley, I want you to tell us about this slide.
I would love to. And I think that it dovetails nicely with the current topic and the current conversation. So I've begun including this slide in a lot of my research talks. And the first question is, do you know who these folks are? And depending on the audience, they know all three, they don't know any, so A is definitely Bayard Rustin, B is Audre Lorde, and then C is Lucy Diggs Slow, right? My second question is, what do all these folks have in common? And it isn't that they're all Black, right? It goes beyond that. And that's where things get hairy, right? So all of these three individuals are queer. So usually there's a question mark on Lucy Diggs Slow. Dean Slow, she is the founder of, one of the founders of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Audre Lorde is a powerful, queer icon with regard to her scholarship and just her taking up space. And Bayard Rustin, I still think we need to atone for him. He is the reason why we had a civil rights movement, really. He was an architect of the March on Washington, right? But was in essence, the people in the Black church, they sat down because he was openly gay, right? But then I'm like, what else do they all have in common? All of them have HBCU affiliation. Bayard is a alumni of 2 HBCUs. Audre Lorde was a poet in residence at Tougaloo. That is where she met her longtime partner. And of course, Lucy Diggs Slow is an icon, the first dean of women Black dean of women in the country, but also the first one at Howard University, and was very remarkable and said she's the founder of the oldest Black sorority. So when you're talking about Dr. Lewis mentioned earlier, people not being seen or not being heard. You know, why don't we talk about the fact that, you know, Byron Rustin is this fierce, you know, Black queer icon, right? But why don't we talk about the fact that he went to 2 HBCUs? Why don't we talk about the fact that he's a whole member of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, right? You know, how powerful would this have been for me if I would have seen this in my community or seen this in my, not community, in my curricula,
Right.
or, you know, when I was in undergrad, you know? Myself and she's doing this work too at UDC, Trinice McNally, she's amazing. Me and her were talking, we could legit do Black queer college tours and go on these campuses and chart the history, right? Like, I know I could give an amazing one at Howard, right? I think about who the buildings are named after. People don't know about Elaine Locke, you know? I mean, you could do so much on these campuses, because one thing is for certain, two things for sure, is that LGBTQ plus folk have always led, attended, and graduated from these schools. And these pictures prove that.
That's dope to me. And I remember I first saw this slide at a conference that we were both at, and you were presenting, and my mind was blown, because of course I was like, wait, what? Because you don't hear about this in history, right? And I'm so thankful that we are, you know, everything is timely and purposeful, that we are in a time now where we have individuals like yourselves who are doing this research and bringing attention to the good work the individuals who are part of the LGBTQ plus community are doing, so that they can't go unnoticed anymore. So thank you for that. Thank you for providing in-depth conversation around this slide.
Can I say something really quick about that slide?
Mm-hmm.
So I went to an HBCU, obviously. I went to ENT, and I took an African American history course my first semester. I wish we would have talked about this slide, because that would have been such a framework for me as a Black queer student, still finding myself, still figuring out how do I navigate this Black space that I got to be on the down low or in the closet in this space. Learning that there were pioneers that had done it before me, that looked like me, that had similar experiences as me, would have been so life-changing for me, Brent, the 18-year-old freshman from Eden, North Carolina, who did not know that it was okay to be himself. So I think about that in the context of my students that attended HBCUs.
Wow, that's powerful.
I would also like to offer this. Thank you so much, Dr. Mobley, for pointing out that 2 of the 3 folks that we have on this slide were also members of Black Greek-led organizations. I have to point out why that is so powerful and why that is so important. If you work at an HBCU, you will not throw a rock and not hit somebody that is a member of one of these organizations. And a lot of times they are thought of as like gateways into whatever professional realm. Like, it is a rite of passage for many people. In certain families, it is something that is inherently a part of the higher education experience. And if you go, like, this is something that you're supposed to do. It is very much so a part of being Black in America. And so to have 2 people up here, two-thirds of the folks on this slide representing Black Greek-led organizations, that is incredibly telling and incredibly powerful, because, again, to the point that we've been making all along, queer Black folks have been around for as long as there have been Black folks.
Right, yeah. And Jennifer, you make a good point that leads me to think that may be a spring session on Black Greek-led organizations, and then adding to that LGBTQ members and what that looks like, right? So thank you for adding that. Okay, so let's talk about all of these terms that I've heard different things. The alphabet soup, you probably heard that. But let's talk about, what do these terms really mean, and if they really mean anything, and how is it relevant today as we look at what does it mean to be LGBTQIA+.
Okay. So one of the many things that I do here at North Carolina Central is to offer safe zone trainings. I will also tailor them to a particular department's needs, so they can request them and say, okay, hey, we're having some things happening in our department and we just need to better understand how we need to work with our students or how we might need to reshape certain things that we do. Cool, I got you. The number one thing, regardless of the department or what their function is here on campus, the number one thing that they always ask for is terminology. And I think this is so interesting because people feel like, okay, well, if I have the vernacular, if I have the vocabulary down, and I know how to recognize people, okay, so you do this, this, and this, this, and you look like this, that means you are this, then it, you know, it makes people think, oh, well, automatically I know how to treat you. Nah. And I'm gonna tell you why. It doesn't work, because you can't go up to one person who is a member of any particular community and say, how do I treat everybody that is a part of your community?
Right.
And the reason why that doesn't work is because of intersectionality. So everybody's going to have all these different experiences that they're bringing to your campus, to your classroom, to your office, to your department, that's going to, you know, really color the way that they experience and see the world. And so while terminology is important, because as human beings, like, yes, we absolutely like to label things and categorize them so that we understand better how to operate in certain types of situations. Just that is useful information, but it's not the end all be all of how to interact with queer identifying folks. Now, give me just a second. Let me talk about the word queer, because Brent talked about being a millennial, me too. Coming up, queer was one of those words that would absolutely get your mouth washed out with soap, or some kind of stern talking to, or something along those lines. But one of the things that we've seen happen, and it's been so interesting, even in my lifetime, to watch it unfold, is that words come in and out of style. And queer is one of those words, you know, at one particular point in time was a pejorative and was absolutely deemed offensive. And so we've seen this reclamation happen. We've seen that happen with, you know, other words like the N-word. You know, there are all types of, you know, people got feelings about that too. And, you know, warning, I'm going to use some coarse language here, the word bitch, that has also been reclaimed by certain folks to say, okay, so you want to call me that? Okay, I got you. Yes, that's me all day. I'm going to be that, and I'm going to still be excellent as I live in all my queerness, or, you know, whatever the term is that people feel a way about at that particular point in time.
Thank you for that.
I would agree with Jennifer that when I've done safe zone training or safe space training, however it's been labeled where I've worked, terminology is the one thing that I spend the most time on, and not just terminology associated with being LGBTQ, but also terminology that's associated with the experience. So talking about transphobia, homophobia, heteronormative behaviors, talking about those types of language with folks who don't get it, it's also a huge challenge. But I think Jennifer hit it on the head when she said, folks want to know these terms and make sense of them so that they can then make sense of how people show up. And that's not always normalizing for people, because I can tell you about what gender nonconforming or gender fluid looks like, but that's going to look different for every individual you come in contact with. So I can give you a baseline of the experience, but that's going to look different based on people's intersections, based on the culture of your institution. That will also guide how that student or that faculty member or that staff member shows up in that space. The other thing is people's lived experiences with these terms. You know, folks who are not in the community have assumptions, perceptions, or beliefs about how these letters show up. Right. You know, Black people think all gay men are effeminate, which is totally not the case. So when I introduce, say, well, you know, there's Black men who are very masculine, who like men. There are Black men who are bisexual. There are Black women who are queer or lesbian that don't show up and look masculine or look like what we identify as a stud. That's shocking because all people that with these letters should appear the same way. And so we have to give honor to the fact that LGBTQ, though we can give you some book definitions of what these letters mean, that's in theory, but in practice, it's going to look different.
Right. Come on, you preach it. I'm trying to find my collection plate. Dr. Mobley.
No, I was just also going to say that basically, like, simply, and it sounds very, maybe what I'm saying is flippant or simple advice, ask somebody what they want to be referred to as. That's the first step, right? And you won't get offended, right? I also think that we need to, I don't think that folks are also ready to have conversations around how words mean things. I loved how Jennifer stated that, you know, words come in and out of style. I begun referring to myself as queer because I'm using that as a mechanism to talk back to a system, right? When I say queer, it is a politic, right? It is inclusive of my gender identity, my gender performance, my sexuality, right? If I just say I'm gay, you're just always thinking about who I'm sleeping with. Where if I am saying I'm queer, I'm moving you beyond that. You need to think of me in totality, right? But then there's also, you know, other terms that people can be seen as distancing, right? I think if you read research or you read articles or if you read, you know, even things in practice and people are still using things like homosexual or, you know, those are very clinical terms. So let's also thinking about that. People thought that if you were a part of this community, period, that you were abnormal. You used to be able to get a check for being, you know, a part of this community. So people thought that you had something was wrong with you. You had mental health issues because you were this. And people say, well, you were that way, right?
Right.
So I think that even when we're talking about this language and just thinking about it, you know, language does evolve, but even the ways in which these terms are used or how students are choosing to use them is very important. I think about, and we'll get to this in a second, but I got pushback when I was going through the process of writing No Pumps Allowed about that Morehouse dress code because I was saying the students were gay and gender nonconforming. And they were like, well, you're conflating terminology. I'm like, no. These students refer to themselves as being gay and gender nonconforming, but people want to put the GNC kids all in the trans bunch. And it's like, no. Like, right? So people aren't even ready to talk about that gender and gender identity and sexuality even being separate things, right? So you want to know a terminology, but baby, you don't even know that these things are separate and they're fluid, right? So, I mean, it's like, if you want to talk, let's talk. Right. But are you ready to have the entire conversation?
Exactly.
Right? Whew, I know some terms, but it's beyond that.
This getting good.
I'm so glad you said fluid because sexuality is fluid as gender identity can also be fluid.
Yep.
I will also say this. So I think really probably the two most shocking things when I am talking about vocabulary, number one, to differentiate between sexual orientation and gender identity. Personally, for me, in my own evolution, my own understanding, just understanding that those were two completely separate concepts blew my mind. But it also enabled me to understand every individual that I worked with exponentially better than I had been before. Sexual orientation, when I'm doing my trainings, I talk about gender referring to who you go to bed as, and sexual orientation being who you go to bed with. That's not mine. I saw it on YouTube, but it's pretty catchy and it helps people remember. But talking about that, and then also the discussion around fluidity, meaning that it's not fixed. It shifts over time. And even if you think about your own understanding of your own self, who you are as a person, you understood that before you understood who you liked. And that's because they are two separate parts of your identity, two separate parts of how you navigate the world. You understand who you are better. Well, you understand that first, and then you begin to understand who you like. Right. And then what you like about them. And those ideas will shift over time.
Yeah.
Can I say one last thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
It isn't that I'm not a fan of the terminology. I just think that people want it to be so, as my wonderful colleagues mentioned before, you know, so fluid, right? Let's even go back real quickly to this pronoun thing, right? One of my really good friends has begun saying open and flexible, right? And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? He was like, well, you know, in the classroom, I may be Mr. or Dr. Blockett, right? He was like, but I'm hanging around with y'all. I could be girl, I could be sis. He was like, but you know, it just depends. I think people are too transfixed on these terms, and that can lead to some violence, you know, ideologically, physically, mentally, you know. And I think that we need to free ourselves of them in a way.
Yeah,
That's
I
all.
think, you know, as we move into the next topic about research on LGBTQ plus community and at HBCUs, want to go back to something, Dr. Mobley, that you said that resonates with a lot of students, faculty, staff, etc. The fact that just because you identify as part of this community, that something's wrong with you mentally. And how we really need to get away from that just because something is different, now you want to associate it as a mental disorder, right? When you have mental health issues that are much bigger than who you decide to go to bed with at night and who you want to show up as. So I just want to bring knowledge and note to that concept of what you said and then the meaning behind it. So thank you for that. So let's talk about research, right? Because you all have done some phenomenal research, and I want to give you the opportunity to talk about that research, and then also talk about what research is left to do as it relates to HBCUs and the LGBTQ plus community.
No, I'll start off a bit. I have been very fortunate to become an emerging or leading voice. I have a hard time accepting flowers, but anyway, on this topic with regard to research within the higher education and student affairs community. When I was a doc student, it wasn't that long ago, believe it or not. I finished around 2015, but when I was in school, I saw very few articles that were about this topic. So I literally was like, something needs to be done about this, right? If you look at, there's a lineage to this work, most definitely. I think that the earliest article I could think about, and I may be wrong, but a book chapter that was published in Michael Sujay's book, Black Men in College, around 1996. It's still been repeated since then. Jimmy Washington, who's a past president of ACPA, wrote an article about Black gay men in college. I think that is one of the earliest articles that was written. And then you get some in the early to mid 2000s. You get some in the late 2000s, and now you have a lot of things that have been coming out or getting churned out since like around 2015. It's an emerging field. If you look at all of it together, I keep a running list. There are about 25 book chapters and empirical pieces that have been written on this topic. And I think there's a lot of work on Black, queer, or gay men, identified students within this, or bisexual, right? A lot of things on males, right? We have very few research on lesbians or queer identified women. There's some spots, right? I think that the work in the beginning was literally writing these students into existence. So you're gonna see a lot about what they're going through, and it's not always easy, right? The work that I've been trying to produce as of late is trying to really resist that tragically queer narrative, because these students are thriving and are literally running these campuses, and they're outside of the center, right? In one of my articles that I wrote with the amazing Dean Squire about how Black gay men choose between HBCUs and PWIs, one of the HBCU participants was like, you know, the gays run this university, right? But I always will push back sometimes to ask the question, but are they out, right? So you have a lot of folks that are, you know, of the LGBTQ community, right? They're Greek, they are in SGA, they're on these homecoming courts, but they're not open, right? But now we're seeing a renaissance, so in a way, you know, the first openly, you know, gay Mr. HBCU was, you know, Mr. Spelman before, right? I mean, and he's just been doing amazing. I mean, there's a really good article on him. He's getting out the vote in the ballroom community. It's just amazing. There is a good amount of research that's being done, but there's so much more that needs to be done. We have barely any trans work, right? I think to date, there's maybe one or two things that are done, like I said, on women that are lesbian identified within these institutions, maybe 3 now, right? There's some really good work that's been done, but there's a long way to go.
Yeah.
I would agree with Dr. Mobley. My entire dissertation focused on lived experiences of gay and lesbian students in an HBCU setting. And writing my literature review was like pulling teeth, because the amount of articles and empirical data out about the lived experience of queer students in HBCU spaces is very limited. I know most of the folks that have some stuff out there just because of writing about it. Steve Mobley was a godsend to me. When I found one of his earlier articles, it kind of set the framework for my work. Jamie Washington, Emily Lennon, who was my colleague at Federal State, we worked together on a lot of things. She started our queer spaces and trainings on our campus. I believe Lori Patton should be credited with some of this work. I think, looking at Mary Beth Gassman had a little bit out. She and, help me out. Yeah, they had a couple of things.
Conservatism, yeah.
Yeah, but in trying to find the work, it's very limited. You do find a lot of work around PWI experiences. So some Black students may be embedded into studies at predominantly white institutions, but really looking at queer experiences in Black institutions is limited. And as Dr. Mobley alluded to, if you are looking for trans studies at HBCUs, good luck, because it's almost nothing out there. And so as I think about future research and implications of it, I didn't look at trans students or bisexual students in my dissertation.
Yeah.
So I'll just kind of bring up the rear and just kind of echo the sentiments of my colleagues. Yes. You will be hard pressed to find any type of information about gender nonconforming, trans, non-binary students. I've not done a whole heap of research into this particular topic, other than the time that I spend with folks, but I am consulted a lot about what I see at HBCUs, because NCCU has been doing this for some time now. There's not a lot. I actually spend a lot of time working with folks who are interested in studying like sexual health and that whole framework of stuff. And there's almost like obsession level research, comparatively speaking, into the practices of cisgender menfolk.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing. My students talk about all the time how they consistently go to the doctor, women who are in same gender level relationships with other women where they're being offered birth control. Well, that's not a factor for them. They will, they'll tell them, oh, I've never been with a man. I'm not interested in being with men. But there are no offerings, even with our, some of our campus practitioners. There are no offerings for like prophylactics or any type of, anything along those lines for women who are sleeping with women. But those are absolutely concerns that, we should take into account.
Right.
What I am seeing and what I am encouraged by are a lot of the young folks who are coming through graduate programs who are picking up their research, because that's their lived experience, that's their life, and so they know about it and they want to contribute to the body of research because they know that there's nothing out there. And by them being a part of the community, they have access to folks who will know, and then also they will know from their own experiences the different things that should be considered. So that is encouraging for me.
Mm-hmm. And I kind of want to give notice to HBCUs that have centers for LGBTQ plus, and I'm a shout out the institution that allows me to do the work that I do. And so here at A&T, we opened our first ever resource center for the LGBT this past February of 2020. And so do you all know what other HBCUs have LGBTQ resource centers on their campus? I know it's not many, but if you can give name to them, that would be great.
Dr. Mobley, do you want to take this or you want me to jump in?
I'll jump in if you miss one.
Okay, so I'll name the ones that I know of.
Okay.
So I know that Bowie State was the first. And then I was working at Central when Central Center opened, and we were the second. And then when I transitioned to Fayetteville State, Emily Lennon opened the center there, and we were the third in the country. I took on running that center once I got there. Outside of Bowie, Central, and Fayetteville, I think since they were the only three for a long time. And then I think now A&T has a center. There's other institutions that don't necessarily have centers, but are doing really good work.
So the other two centers are
UDC,
so Trinice, and then the newest kid on the block is Prairie View.
Ah, okay.
So we now have 6.
6. Wow.
And what's funny about Prairie View is that I was literally getting an article published, and I had put 5. And I was like, we have to change this because one just got started, so now we have to put 6. So I always like to be my stuff to be as current as possible.
Right.
And I want to make sure they got their flowers. But also what you know about those schools, that all of them are public.
And I was just about, once I read this question, I was going to open up this whole idea of private versus public. And I'm looking at the time, I kind of want to get to some Q&A as well. But what are some strategies we can employ to engage with students and faculty and staff that are part of the LGBTQ plus community at HBCUs? And if you can talk from a lens of what it may look like at a private HBCU versus a public HBCU.
Well, I think one of the differences between private versus public is going to be funding. The funding, if you're looking at creating services and resources, that's going to look different depending on which type of institution. The other challenge with private institutions is that many of them are connected to the church in some way. And so that in with itself directs how they look at this and their willingness to use strategies to engage students. And quite frankly, I don't think any HBCU does a great job engaging queer faculty and staff. Most of this conversation, if it's even happening, is strategies around students. And I'll kind of let my colleagues jump in because I know we're on time.
We'll have to do a part 2.
Yeah, so I can really speak to what it is to engage at a public institution. Although I will say a lot of those same issues that show up at private institutions also show up at state institutions. Specifically, I'm referring to, the linkage or the linking to religious organizations or entities in some kind of shape, form, or fashion. But the rub about state institutions is that you have to, because you are state supported, so you better if you like that funding. But one of the things that we've started to do is to incorporate programming specifically targeting queer identifying folks, period, at homecoming. And to me, that was like one of the most powerful things that we could have ever done. And I'm glad you put this slide up because it definitely talks about recruitment. To have it be included on the homecoming webpage. Yes, we're going to have a drag show, or one year we called it Queer Coming. It was like a luncheon kind of meet and greet kind of thing. And this year we'll be doing some type of networking, online friending type of situation with our alumni and then also our students. That creates community, to say that you are not alone, and when you get out into the world of work, you will have people that are like you, that look out for you. And I think that's something that HBCUs do a really good job at anyway, but to expand that and to begin to saying, yes, you are valued and yes, you are part of our community for queer folks speaks volumes.
Anything to add, Dr. Mobley?
No, I mean, if we're thinking about strategies and how to, move forward, I think that think about the model of practice that I just, put out for how we can retain and have our queer and trans students be successful at HBCUs. I think first we need to start redefining what success looks like, because it always isn't equal graduation, right?
Right.
Success for some of these students, and I don't want to make it, deficit laden or, trauma laden or anything like that. Success for some of our trans students, for instance, is walking across the yard and not being called a slur, right? Success for some of our students is not being misgendered by your biology professor, right? So we have to look at this on a microscopic, a macro, and a micro level, right? I put a footnote in that article, redefining queer and trans student success at HBCUs. I'm saying that if you don't have to do it in its entirety. If you do one thing, so if we're thinking about recruitment and retention, if you put an openly queer or trans person as one of your tour guides during orientation and recruitment days, how powerful would that be for a potential student to be able to see themselves in that way?
Right. Allowing
a banner for preferred names and pronouns to be used, right? Revamping your student affairs, trainings to be inclusive of these topics. Putting these topics on the forefront, not only at homecoming, but doing orientation. Let's normalize these things. I mean, any of these things done together, and I can go on and on, will change your campus exponentially, right? If you think about it as a hospital triage unit from when you enter to when you end, right? And with HBCUs, we wrap around because we love our schools and we'll always be back, right? So if you're able to engage these students before they even hit campus and after graduation, I wrote an op-ed when Howard started the Lavender Fund. And I said, as much as I loved Howard, I always wondered if it loved me back. And this is the first time that I felt that it loved me back, when they were putting these issues or started this fund, which, as Jennifer mentioned, it happens during homecoming, right? I gladly give my annual gift all to the Lavender Fund, because I know that it's stopping these things on campus, right? So what does this really mean, or how we're engaging these students, faculty, and staff? I always say, if faculty and staff were supported to be, if they choose to be out, right? Because that's a performative privilege, let's be clear with that, right? That they're able to show their students that it's possible, and they're not scared of, retaliation or, these consequences of conservatism, these campuses could look totally different.
And you bring up a good topic about what does student success really look like. And it's not always just the number of graduation rates and retention. And that's a whole different conversation. So I'm not gonna go down that rabbit hole. But I wanna open up for any questions that we may have from our audience. And you feel free to unmute yourselves or place your question in the chat. We have Tiffany Tuma, who's at St. Augustine University out in Raleigh, North Carolina, who says that, she's at a small private, and just thinking about the ways of how do you engage the LGBTQ plus community. We also have just some kudos to you all in terms of the knowledge and the wisdom that you've dropped, and being able to share some of this with some of their colleagues in different spaces on campus.
I wanted to provide something for Tiffany. Tiffany, I will say, from a small private institution's perspective, I can connect you, but I think you should reach out to Frank Dorsey at Johnson C. Smith University. I think they would be the closest in terms of size and culture and type of institution to St. Aug that's doing really good queer work at an HBCU. Frank has done a lot of safe space training, programming. He's the director of student activities, so he's infused it into their programmatic models. So even at a small private where funding is a challenge, if you use it as a universal design meaning it's embedded into every aspect of the institution, and it's not just a focus of student affairs, or it's not just a focus of one person on campus, then it becomes a normalized experience for students. And that recruitment and retention piece comes into play there.
And I will echo that because I actually met Frank when I visited Johnson C. Smith for one of my HBCU tours, and just the conversation with him and the work that he's doing is phenomenal.
I was actually we're singing, I wish that he was on here, but I was also gonna recommend with regard to with what Dorsey's been able to do is that he's also engaged in the local community, right? So during Black Gay Pride, the town hall was held at Smith, right? That's saying something, right? During the overall Pride events, they were at and present at the college fair, right? And he also engages like different local nonprofits. Students volunteer there. Some of the students use their services. I think if there's something that's not on your campus, don't be afraid to engage your local community who are having these conversations and are having some of these services, because I'm sure they would love to be in partnership with their local HBCU. I'm thinking about Raleigh in particular. I think that there's ways that you can get around that.
So I would also offer that passive programming goes a long way. Dr. Mobley mentions something about, just having your community be visible, how that can speak a lot to retention and recruitment. So when we first started the LGBTQ Resource Center here at North Carolina Central, there was no budget. There was no money. But what I did have was Instagram on my phone. And so as a graduate student at that point in time, that was one of the things that we did. It was just beginning to offer, just like this flag in the middle of cyberspace to say, hey, we're here. Mm-hmm. I can tell you there's not been any numbers on it, like really crunched. But what I do know is that a lot of students will come up to me at the end of their tenure here as an undergraduate and say, I came to NCCU because I saw on Instagram that y'all had a center here, and they may not have ever stepped foot into the center, but they'll wave at me and I'll just be like, oh, well, hey, baby. I don't know their names, but they know who I am, and they know that there's a center here and they have a place to go if they should ever need. With this being, where there's like, a Queer History Month or Coming Out Day, to make a post and say, hey, we see you, we acknowledge you. This person is an alum of our institution, and they were open and out and they did all these wonderful, great things in the community. Let's celebrate them today.
Yeah.
That brings in like institutional interest. And then also like your students and then other folks who are interested in your institution will also say, okay, well, I can see myself there because it's been done before.
Right. So we have one last question and then we'll do a wrap up. Do you all think that this research would be more beneficial if completed by someone who attended an HBCU, or do you think it would be more transparent, revealing if completed by a PWI scholar within the LGBTQ plus community?
Can I just say this, because I saw that and I was thinking about it, I started writing notes on it. I think that the level of cultural competence is what matters. Mm-hmm. And so if you have an idea of what to expect, because let me tell you, as someone who absolutely attended a PWI and then did my grad work at an HBCU, they are very different spaces. Mm-hmm. And not even just with, the demographics that will be there, but also with the culture of it and the way that it feels. And even though I been Black all my life, coming to an HBCU was a very different experience than I had at my undergrad or at the other institutions that I had worked at previously.
Right.
I'll jump in really quickly. I think that a lot of this work, some of this work has been already done by people that went to PWIs, right? And I think that it's really, really good work. I do think that cultural competency piece is very key. I will say this though, because HBCUs have been disregarded and mistreated so often in the research and during the research process, they are very protective. Jennifer Williams is one of these, right? With regard to being a gatekeeper of their students and allowing quote unquote outsiders within, right? I think that HBCUs have been receptive to my work because I am of these schools. So the medicine is a little bit easier to swallow because of someone that was within the culture saying it. that I think if someone that is a PWI graduate, I think they're going to have to know they're going to have to work a little bit harder through the vetting process and the skepticism that may occur, because HBCUs have a reason to be distrustful of outsiders and to be able to do that.
Ooh, you said a word right there. And that's coming from someone who has all of my degrees at a PWI, but all of my professional experience outside of 1 year has been at a HBCU. I know that Dr. Lewis has to jump off, so I wanted to know if you had any last remarks to provide before you jump off.
Just want to say I've really enjoyed this conversation. We need to do this again and in another session. I've put my email address in the chat if anyone wants to reach out. And yep, Jennifer, you're right. It came out of housing, and then the vice chancellor at the time supported the cause. So that's another point that I wanted to make before I leave. With this work, your leadership has to be in support. It will not be it may start off bottom up, like it may start off with students and faculty and staff, but if there is no leadership support, it would be a challenge to get off the ground. Mm-hmm. Thank you all, and I'm glad I was able to join. Sorry I have to run away, but take care.
No problem, thank you. And so just wanna, since we're on that part, just give our other panelists the opportunity to do final remarks, and then I'll wrap up.
So I'll say this, thank you so much for having me. It's been a joy, like in meeting and then also reconnecting with folks that I already had existing relationships with. This was really good for me. But I will also echo exactly what Brent said, because he and I were here at NCCU at the same time when our center started. If your leadership is not on board and there's not money behind it, it doesn't have to be a whole lot of money, just some, then, you know, it would just be an idea. Mm-hmm. I would also say, like, for the different ways that I've had to and had an opportunity to push the envelope on things, I've always been able to stand behind my students because the ideas come from them first. They will tell you what they need. At NCCU, back in '89, we started our first LGBT student organization. '89. We didn't get our center until 2013.
Wow.
So students have been saying for a very long time, this is who I am, this is what I need. You're trying to figure out how to keep me here, trying to get me to come back and send my nieces, my nephews, and my kids here. This is what I need. Mm-hmm. Listen to your students, they'll tell you.
Thank you.
I also want to say thank you so much for allowing me to be here and, you know, run my mouth about some things that I'm very, very passionate about. I will say this work for me is like homecoming, right? It is very near, it is very dear. If anybody on this call is very familiar with an HBCU homecoming, it's literally a family reunion. I do this work because I think that it's very important for me to hold the schools that I love to the carpet, because I knew what I had to do to ascend to a certain social hierarchy when I was in college. And I don't want the students coming behind me having to endure those same environments, able to bring their full selves to their campuses, their whole selves, right, to these HBCs so they can do whatever they will want to do. I do want to say that I'm glad that we were able to also talk about vanguards and hallmarks, because there are a lot of HBCUs doing amazing work that are not being uplifted in the media all the time. I think that the work that's been going on at, you know, Spelman and Howard and sometimes Morehouse has been good with their advancements, but there are more schools out there that are doing more things, you know, at Central, at John C. Smith, at Alabama State, at UDC, at A&T, and I can go on and on and on, right? Dillard, right? They're publics and they're privates. They're big and they're small. So there are a lot of HBCUs that are doing this work and doing this work well and have been doing it for years, right? And that needs to be uplifted and talked about.
Awesome, thank you. So as we wrap up, I want to bring notice to something that I had a conversation with an individual this morning. As part of the Gates-funded partnership with NASPA, the National Resource Center for the First Year Experience of Students in Transition is hosting a professional development and networking opportunity that's dedicated to advancing the conversation about advising as a tool for student success and equity at HBCUs. And so I wanted to give notice to this, and, you know, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to the individuals that are listed below. And as part of this participation, you have it's a HBCU professional learning opportunity community, right? They're also looking to give away travel scholarships for those who participate for the in-person HBCU symposium, which will be held in October of next year. And so also opportunities for scholarship and best practice publication. So I just want to give recognition to them for that. And then also, before I close this out, just want to, is today, and I think I'm saying this right, HBCU Out Day?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So, because I saw it on my social media, and then I saw some people with shirts, and I was like, all right, y'all know I like shirts. Ain't nobody bought me no shirt. But yes, want to give recognition that today is HBCU Out Day. And so for those that are watching this recording and those that are on the recording right now, that, you know, always know, at least here in my space, you have a safe space. And that I want to thank you all for doing the work. That's where it starts. And that I hope that people begin to see the work that you all are doing and want to join your efforts so that the legacy continues to grow and continues to move on. And so I just want to personally thank you all for being here and holding the space with me. I also want to bring note that our next webinar, our next show, episode, whatever you want to call it, will be next week. And we're talking about HBCU enrollment during COVID-19. And we're talking to some top enrollment management leadership officers at HBCUs, and that is October 29th at 12 p.m. But once again, I can't thank you all enough for the work that you're doing and how you are truly being trailblazers in this work, and also for HBCUs.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was good. I really enjoyed it.
No problem, no problem. Thank you. And thank you all who have participated in joining on the conversation. Have a great day.
You too.